Hi guys, it's October and therefore it is time for my creepy post of the year. Now tonight I'm going to be talking about some very heavy topics. I'm going to be talking about murder, I'm going to be talking about gender-based violence. So if that's not something that you want to listen to, now is the time to change the channel. If, on the other hand, you are interested in that, know that you are not alone. This is one of my favourite reads on the subject. It's by a guy called Peter Laws, who is a Baptist minister, and it's a really interesting exploration into why people are drawn to the dark and the macabre. So if you're somebody who's never been interested in horror or, dark literature or anything like that, and you're not sure why people are, this is a great read for understanding that pull and why people are interested in these subjects. And if, like me, you have always been interested in these subjects, it helps you to feel a little more normal because it explains a lot of the psychology mechanisms behind that, and it's just really fun. So anyway, tonight I am going to be talking about something that was in the newspaper when I came back off holiday. So I've recently been on a 3-month jaunt and come back to Rwanda, where I live, and there was a story that really grabbed my attention when I got back. And it's the story of a man called Denis Kazungu, who was arrested on suspicion of being a serial killer. Now, according to the sources, according to the newspapers, he is 34. His neighbours described him as being a well-dressed, well-mannered individual. And little did they know that in the rental house that he was inhabiting, he had dug a hole in the kitchen and filled it full of bodies. Now, I have to preface everything here with allegedly, because he has not yet been convicted at the time of recording. However, he has confessed to the murders and the evidence is fairly overwhelming. So apparently he had got behind on his rent and his landlord had gone over there to say, well, look, you need to pay or get out. And his behaviour led people to become suspicious. So instead of saying, oh, okay, I'll get the money together, I'll pay you by the end of the week, apparently he started to sob. Apparently he started to get very, very agitated and, was crying. And his behaviour led, I think, the landlord or the neighbours to go to the police. And he confessed to what he'd done at the police station, according to the reports in the newspaper. There has not been a lot released about this. I think if this had been in the UK or many other countries, the tabloids would have been all over this. In Rwanda, these things tend to be kept quite close to home until the facts are fully established and an official statement has been given. So there have been a few reports. It even made, I think, BBC News. It's even made international news because it is such a gruesome crime. So essentially, when the Investigation Bureau, RIB, went over there, they found 12 remains, 12 individuals in the pit, although I think very few of them have actually been identified or named yet. But before they even went over there, Denis Kazungu had admitted to killing the 12 people in the pit, plus he said there were 2 others that he had attempted to dissolve. So he tried to do a bit of a Jeffrey Dahmer there. So originally it was being reported that he had gone after prostitutes, and, I was ready to spout off about that because that is a particular topic that irritates me to high heaven because it's such a predictably pathetic MO of a bloke going after women who are less likely to be able to defend themselves and less likely to be reported missing. If tomorrow one of my friends goes missing, I'm going to go down the police office and I'm going to say, hey, excuse me, I think my friend's missing. But if I'm a sex worker and my colleague or my friend goes missing, I'm going to be thinking twice about reporting that because you know, there's a certain stigma in almost every country in the world still attached to prostitution and sex work. And so you're going to be thinking, if I go to report this, am I then going to be interrogated? They're going to want to know how I know this person. They're going to want to know what I do for a living. They're going to want to know where I last saw this person. And those are questions that I might not feel comfortable answering, especially if my friends and family don't know what I do, because you know, there's so much stigma and so much shame attached to that. And that's just something that really kind of gets my goat, because I absolutely believe that prostitution should be legalised and it should be regulated. At least if you bring in legalisation and regulation, then these women are guaranteed at least a minimum wage for the work that they're doing and the service that they're providing, access to health care, which is extremely important all round. And if violence occurs or one of them goes missing, somebody notices that, you know, and it's not difficult to come forward and mention it. So, you know, violence against women and violence against sex workers in particular really irritates the hell out of me. It's just, yeah, it shouldn't be happening in this day and age. But anyway, it appeared that he'd been finding women in bars. Whether they were sex workers or not is not entirely clear for every case, because a lot of the people haven't been identified yet. And there was definitely at least one man in the pit as well. So we don't know yet. But apparently he'd been going out to bars, picking people up, taking them home. And then he had been forcing them to give up their mobile phone money. So here in Rwanda, I haven't got my phone on me. I was going to show you, but I haven't got it on me. I'm just going to search randomly around. Yeah, so my phone. So my phone is basically like my wallet. We use something called mobile money. And that just basically means that you're carrying around cash on your phone that only you can access if you've got the codes and all of the information required to do so. So what he was doing was he was taking people home. He was forcing them to give out their mobile money codes. He was emptying their accounts. And then he was sexually assaulting them and murdering them. That's what we know so far. Now, what was kind of interesting about this is this is a shocking crime in any country, but it's particularly shocking here in Rwanda as well, because the instances of violent crime are pretty low. Sort of violent robbery, that kind of thing, is really low. So, I mean, this is something that everybody sort of went, whoa, okay, that's a lot to take in. So like everybody, I was interested in this case, and I was kind of drawn to it thinking, is that the first serial killer that we've caught in Rwanda? And I know some people might be going, what about 94? But I'm going to put that in a very separate category, because the psychology involved in war crimes and in genocide is very different to the psychology of an individual acting alone in peace times. And I think we need to draw a bit of a distinction there. There is something that has been postulated called Syndrome E, which has been put forward in the case of Holocaust and genocide to offer an explanation as to why seemingly normal people will become killers under certain circumstances. I might leave a link to that below if you're interested. But for our purposes, these are very separate crimes. These are very separate. These are very separate motives. So I was thinking, so this is the first serial killer that was caught in Rwanda. And then I realised he wasn't. There was actually another guy called Alois Tuberimo, who was, I think he was arrested in 2007, in December 2007, which is about a month after I arrived in the country. And then he was sentenced in 2008. And this guy's MO is kind of similar. Basically, so in Rwanda, we have public motorbikes called motos. And motorbikes, they act like taxis. So if you're on the street and you want to go somewhere, you put up your hand, you do this, you get on the back of a motorbike and you tell them where to go. And it's a really, really popular form of public transport in Rwanda. And then out in the rural areas, you tend to get the same thing, but with bicycles. So they're called cyclos. And apparently what he was doing, this Alois, is he was taking cyclos home from work or wherever it was that he was going. And when he got home, he would offer them a drink. And the drink would be drugged, and he'd wait till they started to get sleepy. He'd hit them with a blunt object or a hammer. And he would put their bodies down a hole in the garden. So very similar, really. And then apparently he'd take their bicycles and sell them. And from what has been said, he was selling them from anywhere between 12,000 francs to 18,000 francs. So about $10 to $15 per bike, which is a horrific thing to think about, that is what your life was worth. Like, you were killed for a $10 bike. Anyway, so he apparently murdered 7 people before being caught. And that kind of just made me go, oh, because I hadn't realised that there were 2 serial killers that had been caught. He was sentenced in 2008 to life in solitary confinement. So I don't know if he's still in solitary confinement. I don't know what happened to him after that. But yeah, that's what happened. So I sort of got to thinking after that because, coming from the UK, I have grown up my entire life hearing about serial killers. I mean, the big ones in America, because compared to anywhere else in the world, America, if you look at the statistics, is a hotbed of serial killers. They have had so many, far more than any other country, and I'll go into that a bit later. But, you grew up hearing about sort of Ted Bundy, obviously, Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, Son of Sam. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. But also in the UK, we've had our fair share as well. So in the UK, the big name in history was Jack the Ripper, who pathetically, predictably went after prostitutes. And basically, he was the big name serial killer that sort of, I think, really made people aware that people could be serial killers, that people could do this to more than one victim or, to strangers. And he was actually never caught, so we never knew who he actually was. There were many, many theories about it, but nobody ever figured it out. And that was back in the 1800s. More recently, I mean, there's the Moors murderers, there's the Wests. So Fred and Rosemary West were, serial killers. I think our biggest serial killer, and perhaps one of the biggest serial killers that we've ever known in history, is a guy called Harold Shipman. Now, Harold Shipman was a doctor who used to give lethal injection to his elderly patients, I think mostly female elderly patients. Some of the newspapers claim he had up to 250 victims. Wikipedia seems to say 218 confirmed victims. And you'll find this when you're looking into serial killers, there is often a lot of hazy information and a lot of sources don't agree. So, growing up, I knew all about this. And, in the UK and in America, there's a long tradition of making films about serial killers, be they real or fictional. I mean, Psycho, for instance, was a hugely popular film. But the story of Dennis Kazungu kind of made me stop, and I sort of thought, well, I don't know anything about African serial killers, really. I don't know if it's as prolific in Africa. I don't know whether or not people who have been convicted operated in the same way as they did in Western countries. I don't know if the motives are similar. I don't know if... I just don't know anything, really. So I thought that I would have a little bit of a look through. I've always been very interested in crime statistics. So back doing my MA, part of my MA involved studying forensic linguistics, which I thought was a fascinating topic. It's all about the language of crime, anything to do with language and crime. So, for instance, we studied the language of rape trials, which looks at How language is used to discredit, a lot of the time, witnesses in rape trials or to intimidate women in rape trials, and how the language that we use and even the pitch of our voice can make us more or less believable in a courtroom, which was a fascinating topic. We studied how language caught the Unabomber, which was very interesting. So the Unabomber was... he was a terrorist in America who used to send bombs to universities and academics, I think mostly. It's a bit hazy, I haven't studied this for a long time, but he had a particular way of using language. So every person has an idiolect, and an idiolect is the specific way in which you use language. So it's as unique to us as our fingerprints are. And because of the very specific way he used language, he was actually dobbed in by a family member who recognised the pattern of speech in his writing. So language and how we use language, especially in crime and law, is very interesting to me. And my MA thesis was about how deaf people or sign language signers and second language English speakers are treated as victims of crime, whether or not the language that they use, and especially with sign language, the way that they express themselves quite physically, can have an effect on how they're perceived by police and members of the courtroom. So, you know, this has always been a really fascinating subject for me, and I wish I'd probably done more to do with forensic linguistics when I did my MA, but I went down the language and communication research and social linguistics route because I thought that would probably lead to more of a career because forensics is hard to get into. But anyway, it's still something that really interests me, and I think that's why whenever we're looking at things like, you know, anything to do with crime, serial killers, anything to do with that, I'm always interested in the numbers. And again, it's quite frustrating with this topic because it's really hard to find clean data about serial killers and about, you know, numbers, stats, victims, anything to do with that. So I started out by Googling African serial killers, which led to a slightly awkward mistake. I just assumed that the results coming back were Pan-African and that it would be data and statistics on the whole of Africa. And so I clicked on one of the links and it took me through to a Wikipedia list, and it's just lists and lists of names and crimes. And as I was scrolling down and clicking on each of the cases to read more about them, I started to notice a slightly disturbing pattern. Is that every name that came up said South Africa. So I clicked on one and it said, you know, serial killer killed so many people, South Africa. Second one, South Africa. Third one, South Africa. Fourth one, South Africa. And I was sitting there thinking, why are all of the serial killers in Africa from South Africa? What is it that makes South Africa particularly dangerous? And so then I went back to the main Google search and I suddenly realised that the list I had clicked on was specifically for South Africa. So that suddenly made a bit more sense. But it turns out that South Africa is the country in Africa that has got the most data. It was really, really hard to find data from any of the other countries. So almost all of my data comes from Wikipedia. There are gaping holes in that data, there really are. But it's basically the only access I could really get on a kind of a quick want-to-know basis without being an academic and having access to academic databases. According to what I found and the statistics I've got in front of me, there were 43 serial killers from South Africa, a couple of them working as couples, so usually husband and wife, and I've counted them separately. But out of those 43, only 2 of them were women. And so 43 from South Africa, and then according to the wiki list that I could find, only 18 for the whole of the rest of Africa. And those countries included Algeria, Eswatini, which was former Swaziland, Ghana, Morocco, Nigeria, Rwanda, Tunisia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Belgian Congo. But I have to remove Zimbabwe and Algeria from that because The two cases mentioned there were committed by expats. So in Algeria, it was a French woman, I think, who had gone to Algeria and become a serial killer, or was a serial killer and moved to Algeria. And in Zimbabwe, it was a Scottish man. So I think he was a doctor as well. So I thought it wasn't really fair to judge a country by what foreigners had done in that country, if that makes sense. But in all cases except for Egypt, there were never any more than 2 caught in history or that have been documented and reported. Egypt came out quite ahead. They've had 4, and I think one of them was a husband and wife team as well. Now, whilst I was going through the South African data, there was an interesting one that did leap out at me. Is in 2006, a guy called Richard Nyauza was arrested. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Nyauza. And he was arrested for having killed 18 women and dubbed the quarry killer because he dumped their bodies in a quarry. Now, the reason that this particular case stood out to me is because he claimed that he went on the killing spree having been infected with HIV, I assume by a sex worker. So he blamed a woman for having given him HIV, and in his mind, that gave him license to go out and murder 18 people. And the reason that this became kind of lodged in my brain is because this is a defence that Denis Kazungu in Rwanda is also putting forward. He is claiming that he murdered 14 people because they, I guess collectively, gave him HIV. That's just the most insane defence. Firstly, in order to have contracted HIV, I'm assuming you had unprotected sex. So I'm sorry, but that responsibility is squarely on your shoulders as well. Secondly, contracting an STD from somebody is not reason to murder somebody. Thirdly, contracting HIV today in the 21st century is not a death sentence. Antiretrovirals mean that you are going to live a very long and healthy life. They can even bring the infection rate down so far that it's not detectable anymore and cannot be transmitted. I mean, to be fair, maybe living in a rural village, he didn't know any of this because there's still a lot of stigma attached to HIV and people still have a lot of misinformation. Next one. Even if you are extremely angry with somebody because you perceive that they gave you an STI, putting aside the contraceptive barrier issue, how do you share the responsibility for contracting it once with 14 people? You know, I'm sort of sitting there just thinking like, yeah. So, I mean, none of that to me logically makes a lot of sense. And I assume that probably Kazungu and Nyauza both went for that defence because they felt it would gain them sympathy from the public. And again, all of this allegedly with Denis Kazungu because he hasn't come to trial yet. But I assume that's a play for some form of sympathy because it doesn't make any rational sense at all. Anyway, but I wonder if he came up with that as his defence by himself or whether he'd actually read about Richard Nyauza in 2006 and thought, aha, that's probably a great defence. I mean, it didn't work for Richard Nyauza, so, you know, I can't see why you go, oh yes, that's my ticket out of here. But apparently Denis Kazungu has actually said that he has been watching a lot of documentaries about serial killers. I think he cited Ted Bundy at one point, and he said that he was picking up tips on how to kill people. I'm assuming he must have watched Dahmer because of the whole acid bath thing. But I think we've got to be a bit careful with engaging in this kind of rhetoric because it reminds me very much of the violent video game argument about, oh, we mustn't let anybody play violent video games because violent video games make you violent. Research doesn't support that. It's similarly with watching true crime. I mean, I watch a lot of true crime. A lot of my friends watch a lot of true crime. A lot of us talk about it. A lot of us, you know, we are really interested in it. And if people weren't interested in these kind of documentaries and these kind of series, then it wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar industry in Hollywood. But it is, and it's all over Netflix because people consume it and people watch it. But watching it does not make you want to go out and do it. As the book that I mentioned earlier, The Frighteners, goes into a lot of detail, there's usually a couple of reasons that people are really drawn to watching crime and watching true crime, and why we're so compelled by it to kind of watch more of it and consume more of it. And the two main reasons tend to be, firstly, it's almost like a moral reassurance. If you are a good person, or, you know, even if you're just an average person, if you're the kind of person who occasionally cheats at cards but doesn't go out and kill people, then watching this kind of documentary is kind of reassuring, because you can look at somebody doing something truly bad and go, whew, well, at least I know I'm not like that. You know, I don't have the urge to do that in me. And it's kind of a cathartic, reassuring sort of, oh, okay, you know, yeah, really bad things happen in the world, but whatever I might be doing, I'm not that bad, you know. So there's that aspect to it. And the second aspect is largely for women. A lot of women watch violent movies, and often horror films in which women are the victims, which is kind of counterintuitive, because you're thinking, you know, well, surely women would find that really abhorrent and don't like movies where women are victimized and, you know, terrorized. But the other part to that is that it does tend to allow you to watch a violent or a horrific situation unfold from the safety of your own home and from a safe distance, and think through it yourself and sort of think, well, if I was in that situation, what would I do? How could I get out of it? And I think that's something that draws a lot of women. I mean, women and men, you know, it's all very interesting to watch it from a very safe distance and think about it and go, right, well, you know, if that was going to happen to me, what would I do differently? Or how would I try to get myself out of that? And it's works, because over the years, you know, by watching a lot of these things, and also by watching films in which women are in abusive relationships, I think a lot of women are starting to recognise much more quickly the danger signs of certain relationships and certain controlling situations. I think, you know, they serve a purpose, and I think that's why there's so much interest in it. But at the same point, you know, violent movies and violent video games don't just turn people into violent people, and people who play them and watch them are not usually violent people. But if you already have a tendency to violence within you, I think that would attract you. I mean, you're probably more likely to gravitate towards violent things if you are already a violent sort of person, but for very different reasons to the rest of us. Most of us are watching it for entertainment value. You're watching it as a instruction manual. I don't know. That, I think, is what he was trying to say, was he was watching these people to try and pick up tips. Yeah. So there was one other South African crime that really stood out to me. It was a lady called Rosemary Ndlovu, who was a former policewoman who murdered 6 members of her family for the life insurance. And this kind of got me thinking, because going through the list, there does seem to be kind of 2 main reasons for committing mass murder. One of them does seem to be about money. So she did it for the life insurance, and Aloys, who we were talking about in Rwanda before, did it for the bike money, selling the bikes. I'll come back to this in one moment, actually, because the other one seems to be sexual compulsion. So usually men, or a man who has coaxed a woman to work with him, going after women, often sex workers, and or children, for sexual gratification. That's an interesting one because it does seem to fall into two camps. And the ones that do it for money, quite a few of them, like Rosemary, seem to go after family members. So they come home from work one day and just go crazy. Now, I think when we're talking about serial killers, I don't know about you, but for me, those ones worry me less. And I think that's because I really trust my family members. I love my family members. I'm fairly sure they love me. They've never kind of given me any reason to believe that they're going to batter my brains in. And also because I'm not rich, so I don't really have any money that they would do that for. So I don't know. Those ones don't feel like a personal threat, but the ones that really kind of, I think, get into people's minds and get under people's skins, and the ones that we think about when we really talk about serial killers and, you know, the danger of serial killers, are the ones that are unpredictable. So the Ted Bundys, who, it could have been anybody, you know, you don't know what that person's perversion is. If you happen to fall into that category, you could be anybody and they would go after you. You know what I mean? It's the fact that they go after random strangers and that there's no discernible connection there. And that's also what makes them particularly difficult to track down and capture. Because, you know, most people are murdered by members of their family or somebody that they know. I believe that's the statistic, is you're most likely to be murdered by somebody that you know. So the really dangerous ones and the ones that are very hard to apprehend are the ones that don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to who they're killing. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel in my head like there's two separate types of killer when we're coming into serial killers, but I might be wrong. I find it's quite complicated when you're looking at all of these lists and lists of different crimes, that they firstly fall into two categories, one for mostly sexual gratification and one for financial gain. But within that, you've got a whole subsection of stuff going on there. Like, I question the ones who said they did it for money, maybe more than the ones who did it for gratification, because I feel like people who did it for gratification, it's abhorrent, but it's honest. You know, whereas the one about the money, maybe, but I don't know. I feel like within that, there might be some who did do it for money, but I feel as well there's probably a few in there using that as an excuse, or what they feel to be a more socially acceptable excuse. Let's go with Aloys again. So he took the cyclo drivers home and he murdered them and he sold their bikes. But I don't think selling the bikes was his primary motive there. I don't think the money was the primary motive. $10, $15. I mean, to be fair, back in 2007, that was quite good money. I mean, I was about to say that was a lot of money. It was quite good money. And if it was only about the money, you can steal a bike and sell it without killing the owner. But I mean, we definitely know that there are murderers out there who do it just because they want to. And then I think they try to find an excuse afterwards. Like I said with Aloys, you know, doing it for the bikes doesn't quite seem to ring true. I think he sold the bikes after he'd done it because it was something extra to do. I don't think he did it for the bikes. I don't know. I am not a psychologist. I am just armchair sleuthing here because October, time on my hands. Okay, so one of the main questions I had running through all of this was, how worried should we be about serial killers? How prevalent is it? And, you know, how likely is it that you could be a victim of this sort of crime? Because again, you know, growing up in the UK, watching Hollywood, watching BBC dramas, you know, there's a serial killer around every corner, you know, every single one of these corners. And obviously, when crimes of a certain size hit the media, they always make front page news. So psychologically, it feels like this is quite a legitimate threat. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a dive now into some of the statistics that are known. So come with me. Realising that Wikipedia definitely wasn't the best source of data on serial killers, I went in search of something better. An article by Taylor Stacey on the University of Michigan's website led me to the official source of all good data on serial killers. a database jointly maintained by Radford University and Florida Gulf Coast University. Every year they publish a report, so I pulled up the one for this year. It contained a really interesting list of countries by the number of serial killers recorded. In 2020, South Africa was 4th in the world for the most number of serial killers caught, behind the US, UK and Japan. But by 2023 it had dropped to 6th place, being overtaken by India and Russia. But more interesting to me than the number of serial killers caught is the percentage of the population that represents. The ratio on the right appears to indicate the ratio of serial killers to a country's population. The lower, the better. Again, South Africa, the country in Africa with the most data known about this subject, fell from a ratio of 3.12 in 2020 to 2.95 3 years later. Although 6 new serial killers appear to have been identified during that period, the rate of population grew far more than the rate of serial killers, making it statistically less likely that you would encounter one. That's my understanding of the data, but please do correct me below if I've read that wrong. If I've read it right, then it means that although Japan has more confirmed cases of serial killers, the size of their population means that it's less likely you would encounter one than in South Africa. So the ratio is a better indication of how prevalent serial killers are in the general population than the total number identified. What's also interesting about the 2023 list is that it includes data on Kenya and Nigeria, which wasn't present in the wiki list or in the 2020 report, so more data is now being revealed about serial killers in Africa. Here, the report starts to get more American-centric, but some interesting statistics show that financial gain was top of the list of motives, followed by pleasure and sexual gratification in men and anger in women. You're more likely to be shot by a man and poisoned by a woman. And, at least in the US, you're pretty much as likely to be a victim of a serial killer if you're male as if you're female. However, in Canada, you're significantly more likely to be the victim of a serial killer if you're female and a sex worker. At a cursory glance of Wikidata, I noticed that of the 41 serial killers listed in South Africa, 11 specifically went after women and girls, and 4 targeted prostitutes. Of the 16 other countries listed, minus expats, 9 went after women and girls, and at least 3 specifically targeted prostitutes, with 2 of those being husband and wife. Despite all this, it's worth noting that the likelihood of being the victim of a serial killer is incredibly low. The database currently contains information on 5,752 convicted serial killers around the world and throughout history. If all of those serial killers were alive today and living in the US, they would represent 0.002% of the population, or around 0.1% of the population of Johannesburg. Even if you tripled that figure to account for all the unidentified serial killers that might potentially be out there, the number compared to world population is minute. There was a fun article I stumbled upon by Leo Chin, which used a Fermi estimation to try to figure out how many times the average person crossed paths with a killer in their lifetime. He came to the conclusion that the average American is likely to encounter just under 11 killers in their lifetime. The FBI reckons that only 1% of murders annually are committed by serial killers. Given that the average murderer kills 1 person, and the widely accepted definition of a serial killer is someone who kills 3 people or more, it's most likely that not a single one of those 11 people you cross paths with will be a serial killer. Of course, if you do have the horrific luck of falling victim to a serial killer, no amount of statistical reasoning is going to make things any better. So don't know about you, but for me, I'm feeling a lot better after that. But there was one last little thing that I'll just mention. It was a slight discrepancy between African statistics and UK-US statistics. And I noticed it through a very scientific, thorough scientific method of drawing a tally chart. So not the most reliable data that we've got here, but I went through all of the South African cases, and I went through the other known African cases, minus the 2 expats, to look at when the crimes were taking place. Because I was curious to know whether or not we're having more serial killers or fewer serial killers as the years go by, because there's quite a lot of data on this in America. So there's a period which is unfortunately termed the golden age of serial killers, which is a stupid title, but it some sources put it from the 1950s to 2000, which is when most American serial killers were active, and then it sort of dropped off very substantially, I guess around 2000. Some people say it's because, you know, greater DNA tracking has come into being. Forensics has advanced so far now that it's almost impossible to get away with a murder, yet alone multiple. Other people say it's because we took lead out of petrol. There might be something to that. And other people say, you know, fathers who had been to war and come out of war didn't always make the best and most relatable parents, and that led to psychological damage in children that led to issues of, you know, psychopathy and serial killing tendencies later down the line. I think, as with most things, it's probably an amalgamation of all of that. So I was expecting to see something similar in Africa, but actually I didn't. It's very, very different here. So the early crimes are, I've put down the early crimes as being anything that happened before 1960. So in South Africa, there were 5, 6, 7 known cases of serial killers, convicted serial killers before the 1960s, according to the Wikidata, which, as I've explained, is totally non-complete. It's only like a tiny, tiny snapshot. And for the rest of Africa, that was 6. So it's about the same. So South Africa is representative of the rest of Africa. You know, there were a fair few of them being caught before 1960. And then almost none being caught or convicted. Well, none caught and convicted in the 1960s in South Africa or the rest of Africa. Only 2 in South Africa in the 70s, none in the rest of Africa. And then from the 80s onwards, it starts to rise steeply. So as you can see from this, in the rest of Africa, it was 2 in the 80s, going up to 9 in the 2000s. And in South Africa, it was 5 in the 80s, 10 in the 90s, and 20 in the 2000s. And again, my data isn't very clean here. It's just a very, very rough sort of snapshot. But that did get me thinking. That was interesting that at the time in the US, that's when there were the most number of serial killers known to be active and being convicted, caught and convicted. And yet in Africa, during that period, there's almost nothing. But then I kind of thought about it a bit more, because the 50s, well, the 60s, 70s, that was really the time in which most African countries were gaining their independence. So for many, there were wars of independence, there were power struggles, there were uneasy handovers, you know, and I think at that time, for many African countries, the police had other things to focus on. So I guess in colonial times, so pre-1960s, a lot of countries had quite tight police forces, foreign colonial police forces. So if people were going missing in villages and villagers were reporting people missing, then, you know, I think that probably would have been investigated. But then, of course, you don't just go from, you know, passing over from colonial times to modern times. In between that, there's a whole upheaval. There is so much going on in society at that point. And then, of course, by the end of the 80s and then into the 90s and 2000s, you've got countries with their own sovereign rule who have got their own police forces, who are not only well-trained and close-knit police forces, but they are also trained in forensics, like Rwanda Investigation Bureau. You know, they work closely with British police and police forces around the world to improve their forensic abilities. So it would be kind of tempting to look at these statistics and go, oh no, you know, there's a mass increase in serial killers in Africa. I don't think that's the case. I think what we're actually seeing here is sort of a joint advancement, firstly of, you know, a cohesive and engaged community policing force. So in Rwanda, there's a real strong emphasis on community policing. And, you know, trust within the local community and, you know, listening to people who are coming to report crimes and actually investigating, and also these huge advancements in forensic science. So now you can test for DNA, you can test fibers, you can, you know, blood spatter analysis, all of those things that you couldn't do, you know, even a couple of decades ago. So I think that's leading to more people being caught and more people being convicted, rather than an actual increase in the number of killers. And I think that big gap that we saw, I mean, I think the reason that there were fewer before the 1960s is we didn't have that DNA ability. You know what I mean? We didn't have that. And that big gap in the middle, I don't know. I think there might be a few reasons for that. I think firstly because police forces and security forces were a little bit busy, kind of, you know, wrestling territory off colonial powers and setting up sovereign states. But also, during times of war and upheaval, I'm going to postulate this, but my feeling would be that if you were that way inclined towards hurting other people, then during wartime, there is more of an opportunity to do that legitimately, or in a legitimate way, or in a sanctioned way. So if you genuinely enjoyed hurting people, you could join a rebel force, you could join a military force, you could, you know, join an institution that would not only train you to do it well, but also reward you for doing it. I don't know if you've ever watched that film, Grosse Pointe Blank, with John Cusack, but there is a part at the end. So basically he is a hitman, and he leaves his high school sweetheart and he goes off and joins the military and he becomes a hitman. And later on, he's trying to explain why he did it. And he basically said, you know, one day I just woke up and I realised I just really wanted to hurt someone. So to avoid hurting the people that I loved, I joined the army. So, you know, to protect the people I loved, I joined the army. And I kind of feel like that might have been it as well. There are other outlets for that kind of behaviour, and outlets that maybe wouldn't be so recognisable as weird or odd. I don't know. That's a theory. That's just a theory. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But yeah, so essentially, I found all of this very interesting, and I think the conclusion that I've come to is that the prevalence of this type of crime is exceedingly, exceedingly low. And so, you know, if you do stumble into this, it's dumb bad luck. And also that the prevalence of it seems kind of universal around the world, that the motivations for these kind of crimes, so money, and sexual gratification, and just a perverse desire to do that, seems kind of broadly universal in a very, very, very small minority of people. Yeah, so I don't know. That's the conclusion I've come to. Let me know what you think. I don't know whether or not I will update on the Dennis Kazungu case, but it's very interesting. I might leave in the comments below if there are any advancements in the case, or if he is sentenced or anything like that. But yeah, I think we've given him enough coverage for now. I think I'm done with that.